Hello, welcome back to the ASH Podcast. We're your hosts, Adam Baker, Shannon Gallagher, and Harrison Scholar-Altman. World War II was known as the biggest and deadliest war in history. This involved more than 30 countries, including Japan, the US, Germany, etc. The war was sparked by the 1939 Nazi invasion of Poland. The war dragged on for 6 bloody years until the Allies, which consisted of the US, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and more, defeated the Axis powers, which were Nazi Germany, Japan, and Italy, beginning in 1939 and ending in 1945. During this time, the Holocaust lasted for 12 years, during which 6 million Jewish people died. Alongside all those brutal and horrible years was the Japanese internment, which lasted from 1942 to 1946. The Japanese internment was when the United States, which was among the Allies, forcibly relocated and incarcerated at least 120,000 people of Japanese descent in 75 identified incarceration sites. These camps were established by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, through his Executive Order 9066, which we will be talked about in this episode.
The start of the Industrial Revolution brought over millions of foreigners wishing to flee crop failure, land and job shortages, rising taxes, and famine. Many came to the U.S. because it was perceived as a land of economic opportunity. This brought a massive European community to the East Coast and a large Asian community to the West Coast. The majority of immigrants came from China and Japan. At the end of the 19th and early 20th century, nationalistic ideas spread worldwide, spreading tensions between countries. European imperialism of Africa and the scramble for Africa and Japanese imperialism of parts of China and Russia were examples of what led to the First World War. The eventual assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand sparked the war in Sarajevo. The Treaty of Versailles ended the grueling 4-year war with major reparations against the Germans. These reparations led to the beginning of the Second World War. In the 1920s, the United States experienced the Roaring Twenties, where a surging economy created an era of mass consumerism. This period brought mass diversity to the United States, which ended up being an issue when the Second World War began. Many people of German, Italian, and Japanese descent were under threat, as many people were suspected of being spies and were regarded as dangerous to the United States. The executive order instated Japanese internment camps where anyone in the U.S. with Japanese ancestry was brought to live in excluded communities in arid areas of America. The internment began in 1942 and lasted 4 years until the end of the war. By the end of the war in 1945, 125,000 people had been admitted into what Roosevelt called concentration camps. The lack of rights caused many Japanese Americans to protest. However, some showed their patriotism towards the United States. Many wanted to join the armed forces, but were denied until 1943 when they began actively recruiting Nisei, a person born in the U.S. or Canada whose parents were immigrants from Japan, to join new all-Japanese American units. More than 30,000 Nisei men served in uniform, mostly in Europe. The final camp to be liberated was in March 1946. President Gerald Ford repealed Executive Order 9066 in 1976, and in 1988, the Congress issued a formal apology and passed a Civil Liberties Act rewarding $20,000 each to over 80,000 Japanese Americans as reparations for their treatment.
Some may claim that the internment of Japanese Americans was justified due to the importance of keeping the United States safe. However, the Japanese Americans were forcefully incarcerated and poorly treated. Therefore, violating the constitutional rights of Japanese Americans is not justified.
First, Japanese Americans were seen as a threat to the U.S. because of their relation to their birth countries and the existing war in Europe. The U.S. began inflicting curfews and excluding people from military areas on the West Coast. Eventually, these exclusion laws led to Executive Order 9066. This executive order, issued by President Franklin Roosevelt, was brought to the U.S. to label and control the Japanese Americans who were seen as a threat to the country. Japanese Americans had no say in any of this. They were forced into assembly centers where they weren't allowed out. Here is Yoshi Nakata, a Japanese American who was interned on March 20th, 1942. How has your life changed since Japanese internment?
I struggled to financially support myself following the war. Previously, prior to the war, I worked at a restaurant where I lived a comfortable lifestyle in San Francisco. My parents sought to live a better life and moved here in 1895. I was discriminated against and struggled to find work in the U.S. This struggle continued for decades. What was your life like in the internment camps? Internees lived in barracks furnished only with cots and coal-burning stoves. Residents used the common bathroom laundry facilities, but hot water was usually limited. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire fences patrolled by army guards who had instructions to shoot anyone who tried to leave. Over time, life in internment camps began to follow its own routine. Students were sent to school every morning, and adult internees were given jobs in farming or maintaining the physical plant. Each camp had a governing council, and many of the institutions of normal community life, newspapers, businesses, sports teams, concerts, places of worship, grew and thrived within the barbed wire. At the same time, however, camp life destroyed some of the most distinctive cultural identities of the Japanese American community. During the case of Hirabayashi versus United States, student Gordon Hirabayashi at the University of Washington was convicted of violating curfew and relocation orders. The court case was deciding if the order was constitutional. This was the first U.S. Supreme Court case that the U.S. heard regarding Executive Order 9066. The order allowed military troops to supervise and maintain authority over Japanese Americans who were excluded from military areas. Eventually, the order was deemed constitutional, and he was charged with a violation of Exclusion Order No. 57. Order 57 established the War Authority, which had the power to remove, maintain, and supervise persons who were excluded from military areas. Hirabayashi never got to clear his name because he later got diagnosed with dementia, which in the end killed him. According to Gordon Hirabayashi, in Why I Refused to Register for Evacuation, 1942, Hirabayashi said, "The right of human individuals to live and to creatively express themselves. No man was born with the right to limit that law, nor do I believe anyone can justifiably work himself to such a position." This conveys the idea that this case was not justifiable because the military order to relocate Japanese Americans was unconstitutional. Forcing someone to relocate and leave everything behind just because of their race and the connections they may or may not have to other countries is not giving people the rights they deserve. In the case of Korematsu versus United States, a landmark decision was made for the exclusion of Japanese Americans. Fred Korematsu was a Japanese American who decided to disobey President Franklin's order and did not evacuate his home and leave his job. Korematsu wanted to stay on the West Coast, so he decided to get plastic surgery on his eyes to alter his appearance and change his name. Eventually, he was arrested on the charge of failure to report to a relocation center. According to the United States courts, in 1983, a pro bono legal team with new evidence reopened the 40-year-old case in a federal district court on the basis of government misconduct. They showed that the government's legal team had intentionally suppressed or destroyed evidence from government intelligence agencies, reporting that Japanese Americans posed no military threat to the U.S. This shows that the internment of Japanese Americans is not justifiable because people like Korematsu never had any evidence that there were any harm to the U.S., and they posed no threat to military during the time of war. In the end, the court accepted the U.S. military's argument that some Japanese people were loyal to their birth countries and not the U.S., therefore sending Korematsu to an assembly center.
Executive Order 9066 supported the Japanese internment as this order was the cause. The president of the U.S. at the time was President Roosevelt, who implemented this order. According to the United States National Archives, it stated that the executive order includes the furnishing of medical aid, hospitalization, food, clothing, transportation, use of land, shelter, and other supplies, equipment, utilities, facilities, and services. Moreover, it was the evacuation of all persons who deem a threat to national security from the West Coast to relocation centers further inland. In the next 6 months, over 100,000 men, women, and children of Japanese ancestry were moved to assembly centers. The Executive Order 9066 was extremely unjustified and stripped the rights of American citizens. Even though they were citizens of America, if there was any sort of Japanese blood involved, they were sent to the internment camps. According to Japanese Incarceration Executive Order 9066, 1942, the order suspended the writ of habeas corpus and denied Japanese Americans their rights under the Fifth Amendment, which states that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. As the Bill of Rights guarantees to citizens, the U.S. completely violated the rights of Japanese Americans. To specify, Japan was on Germany's side during World War II, which were the U.S.'s enemies, and for some reason, President Roosevelt felt that it was necessary to target innocent civilians who were also American. All Japanese people were labeled and controlled in unimaginable ways. According to a transcript called "To All Persons of Japanese Ancestry," National Park Services state all Japanese persons, both alien and non-alien, will be evacuated from the above designated area by 12 o'clock noon, Tuesday, April 7th, 1942. No Japanese person will be permitted to enter or leave the above described area after 8 a.m. Putting restrictions on Japanese Americans was unlawful, and to refer to them as aliens, which at the time would be a slur, was entirely unjustified. Schenck v. United States was another example of how the U.S. wanted to protect itself and supported the Japanese internment. In Schenck v. United States, the Supreme Court ruled the government's use of Japanese internment camps during World War II was constitutional. All defendants in criminal cases must be appointed counsel if they cannot afford their own attorneys, and criticism of the draft was not protected by the First Amendment because it created a clear and present danger to American interests. The U.S. was so worried and selfish that they believed Japanese Americans were a clear and present danger to American interest, as just stated.
In conclusion, the Japanese internment camps ended in 1945 following a Supreme Court decision. 40 years later, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 called for the U.S. to apologize and pay $20,000 to all of those incarcerated. Since the U.S. looked at Japan as one with Germany, they looked at them as homogenous, which was entirely wrong. The U.S. treated Japanese civilians in every unjust way possible. What was life like for Japanese Americans after the internment camps? The camps took their toll on Japanese Americans who spent 3 long years living in isolated prison camps, in an atmosphere of tension, suspicion, and despair. After, when they were released and returned to mainstream U.S. society, they were subjected to hostility and discrimination. Even after years of harsh discrimination, Japanese Americans still suffer inequality.